And yet, here's something that I think we need to think about. Whenever we consider these possibilities, we need to constantly be mindful of the fact that we love to scare the hell out of a film.
Warning, this is not entertainment.
Music has a profound effect on the human experience. There are few things in the world that can manipulate our emotions more than a song. A song can make us inspired, it can make us sad, it can make us more empathetic to the needs of others. But what if it goes deeper than that? What if music can change society? What if it can change our brainwaves and ultimately alter who we are, not as individuals only, but also as a people? This is what I want to talk about on the show today. And to do that, I would like to welcome a guest who is joining us for the first time. He's a friend, he's a fellow podcaster, which we'll talk about in a little while. And above that, he's a musician. He spent a large portion of his life as a member of a band, and he continues to make music to this day. But he's also devoted a lot of time to music theory. What subtle ways does music change us? Yes, at an emotional level, but beyond that, at a deeper level, at an esoteric level. Does music have a mystical influence on the course of human affairs? Well, let's get right into the discussion. I'd like to welcome Daniel Hungerford to the show for the first time. Daniel, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me on, Josh. You up?
Yeah. Yeah, we were just talking offline about whether or not we should go with Josh and Dan or Joshua and Daniel. It sounds a little too Old Testament-y and formal, but I was saying that I tried to get people to start calling me Joshua a couple years back. I'd always been known by Josh, and the meanings of the two names are totally different. Josh is like almost like a fool, right? It's a jester or like a funny guy, and Joshua in the Hebrew means God is salvation, so it's a strong name. But when I tried to incorporate that with my friends, people just thought I was a pretentious dickhead, so I kind of let it go. But
see, I actually didn't know that Josh. I mean, I get like you're Josh and me, right?
Yeah.
See, I totally never put those two things together. And then when we, did the intro, I totally screwed up. I meant to call you Joshua.
No, it's fine. But in all seriousness, there's a lot of truth in the weight of a name, right? So it's really important to name a thing properly, and that's why older generations, older cultures before ours really put so much emphasis on giving their children strong names, which I try to do with my kids in my own way. But when you call something by other than what it is, you're speaking something into it. So for somebody to call me Josh or for me to go by Josh, I'm speaking one identity. But when I say Joshua, I feel like I'm speaking another identity. So maybe it's like this weird little kick I've been on, but maybe other people think it's nuts, but it can come across the wrong way. Just long story short.
There's a biblical precedence for it, right? Like, I mean, when God called Abram out of Ur or wherever it was that he came from, he was he renamed him, right? God renamed him to Abraham.
Exactly. Yeah, Saul and Paul. You see that a couple of times.
Yeah, he renames people.
Yeah, so I'm not crazy. It's important to call a thing by its proper name, even if you try to do it in your mid to late 20s rather than when you're a child.
So your name means God is what? God is salvation?
So the name Joshua, not to brag, I'm just kidding, there's only 2 million of us in the world, but the name Joshua is actually the same Hebrew name as Jesus, right? It's Yeshua.
Oh, Yeshua. Yeah.
Yeah, so it means God is salvation.
Oh, cool. Mine just means God is my judge. Like I don't care what anybody else thinks, which is probably fairly accurate.
It's like Tupac. you and Tupac, only God can judge me, right?
Yeah. Tupac. He's my brother. Came up to me, said, "Hey, mother." I think that was a movie quote. I don't even remember what movie that was from.
I don't know.
Maybe one of your listeners can give us some feedback on that one.
Yeah, I grew up listening to Tupac. I was a huge fan. I used to have the Tupac poster without a shirt on where it says "Only God Can Judge Me," his stomach tattoo, and I thought it was so cool. But looking back, it was a really stupid thing to do.
I could see you doing that.
Yeah. That's a tool.
What? So I thought he had Thug Life tattooed across his
oh yeah, you're right. Sorry. Yeah, sorry, I just committed a faux pas. "Only God can judge me" was the quote on the poster, but it says "Thug Life" across his stomach, the Thug Life tattoo. But I guess it was a famous phrase, "Only God can judge me." I think he had an album called "Only God Can Judge Me." But anyway, I digress. I wanted to really, really
Speaking of
quickly.
music.
Yeah, speaking of music, I wanted to explain to the listeners, and I talked about this a little bit in the intro, about why you're the perfect guest for this. So I don't want to toot your horn too much, but you can give more background here. But you are not only a podcaster yourself and a very intelligent individual, you're also a musician. And you and I recently had the chance to meet for the first time, which we'll talk about in more detail in a few minutes. But I found out before I even met you that you were a musician, and you actually were pretty serious with your band for quite a period of time. So, when you first brought this topic to my attention, and I thought about pieces of this before, and pieces of it I've kind of stumbled across through YouTube videos and other red pill rabbit trails I've run down before. But, you were the one who really kind of, put it all together for me and said, you got to check this out. And I was like, wow, this would be a great idea for a show. And I'm sure there's a lot of listeners out there who are musically inclined who would agree with a lot of your sentiments. So I wanted you to kick us off with talking about the influence that music has over us as individuals, not just in an emotional kind of way, but in a subversive kind of way. Some of the things that music might do that we may not be aware of.
Yeah, man. So, I guess I developed a love for music at a pretty early age. I mean, my parents, they had okay taste, right? Like, so my dad definitely turned me on to the Eagles, when they were listening to records back in the day. And he spent good money on having the latest and greatest audio equipment for a household. And we're talking like speakers that were, 4 feet tall, right? Those were the big giant JBLs, which ironically he bought those back in the early 80s and they still work today. But he would play the Eagles, man. He introduced me to Michael Jackson and just a wide array, kind of an eclectic collection of sounds, if you will. And so I kind of had a decent musical background. And my mom always sang in the choir at church and played some piano and played a little guitar. And when I was in 8th grade, I was kind of in this weird, awkward phase of not playing with my G.I. Joes anymore, but still like having a need to be creative. I was always the kid that would, growing up in Georgia, when we didn't have any money at that time, I would make, forts out of pine straw. So like I've always had this incessant drive to somehow be creative and express myself. So in 8th grade, my mom passed on her classical guitar to me that she had bought when she went, I think, on her senior trip to Mexico. So it's been around for a while now in my family, and I will probably be passing that down to my son. So kind of a cool little lineage hand-me-down there. But, in 8th grade, I just I pretended, right? I tied some shoestrings around it and I strapped it on and jammed out to the music that I listened to back in those days, which was the 311 Blue album. I don't know, are you a 311 fan at all?
Yes, sir. I mean, I was a casual 311 fan in the early 2000s, but in the late 90s, my dad was listening to 311 when they were new and hot.
Oh yeah. Yeah. So, I was jamming out to that, some Rage Against the Machine.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, man. I was more of a rocker kid, kind of growing up, and I kind of pretended to be a musician. Back then, we didn't have YouTube and the interwebs where we could just go learn anything that we want, and that's a whole nother topic for another day, right? Like the internet is literally the modern day tree of knowledge of good and evil. Yeah, but so we had to go get books of tablature and kind of teach myself how to play guitar. Well, a long story abbreviated, I met one of my best friends, Joe Lang, up in Atlanta, and he had already been playing guitar, and he taught me how to play Glycerine by Bush.
Nice.
Yeah, man. which still love that band. I've got a soft spot in my heart for those guys.
That one album, 16 Stone, had so many hits on it. Like all their hits are on that one record.
It was so good. And they had a couple of good hits here and there everywhere else. Like I think they went down like a weird hallucinogenic drug binge and never came out of it. Like their music suffered because of it. Ironically, it wasn't like Pink Floyd and the Doors. They went down a weird like chemical path. Yeah, Gavin Rossdale went down a really weird path there. With all of his little chemical romance, no pun intended. I hate that band. But I noticed at the time I was currently running track, and I'd put in the old Walkman with the anti-skip, and I'd hold on to that thing. That's telling my age right there. And I'd listen to bands like 311 or Rage Against the Machine. Where what's that song? It's the Burnow song.
Oh, Bulls on Parade.
Yeah, Bulls on Parade. God.
Great too.
But see, I would listen to that, and the beat, the rhythmic sound, the beat behind that, and the just thumping, pounding, and the charging forward. I noticed that like my steps would always pick up, and I think that was the first time that I noticed like that music had a sway or a hold over me. And I think that we could all kind of agree with that, right? Like you can think back to a song. Like for me, whenever life was getting chaotic and I needed to kind of find my center again, the Rain song by Led Zeppelin. Are you familiar with that one?
Yeah.
Dude, that song would always bring me back to kind of like center, right? So I realized very quickly that music had sway over our thoughts, right? And it's pretty interesting. There's an article in 2012 that was written by Scientific America. They published an article that was titled "The Power of Music, Mind Control by Rhythmic Sound." Which was pretty interesting. And then in that study, in that article, they actually talked about how music had the ability to grab control of everyone's brain and essentially make everyone, the thoughts of the individual were all like became the thoughts of the group. So the beat that was there, everybody's head would bob to the same beat. The feet would tap to the same beat. And all of a sudden, you've got a group of thousands of people that are all like unconsciously performing the same behaviors, right?
Mm. Yeah, I mean, I buy that. So, like, you think of like big music events like Woodstock or something. If you watch videos of that from the original Woodstock, you see like everybody like nodding their head in unison. I mean, just like that vibe, that like pandemonium that you get at any large concert. If you've ever been to a rock show, I mean, obviously you have, but for the listener, when you see everybody just moving in unison, I definitely buy that. Like when bands, I remember when Slipknot first came out, everybody was freaking out thinking, oh my gosh, these people are going to be able to like control like culture because they'll just speak and they have these people brainwashed and all of their followers will just obey their commands. And at that time it was like, extreme right-wing people saying that, oh, they're going to like, tell people to commit murders and people will go out and do it, kind of like the Manson family mentality. But I definitely agree with what you're saying about music causing like a herd mentality to take place. I've seen it before.
Oh yeah, I mean, look at it like I came from the heavier side of rock, but if you look at any kind of metal band, right, the mosh pit, right, the tones, the chords, and the arrangement of the chords incite certain emotion, right? They invoke certain emotion out of you, which ironically all ties back to like Pythagoras, that was his name. He came up with the Pythagorean theorem, right? He was a mathematician.
Yeah.
And some of the really interesting things that he came up with, he was the one that identified musical scales based off of mathematics. So he figured out there was like a formula that was based on the number of the mathematical scales of harmonics behind a vibrating string, which science ironically proves that too, right? Everything has a vibration to it. When we speak, there is a vibration that's behind that. Our atoms vibrate at certain frequencies, which is really interesting when you really want to sit down and kind of break that down. And, we know that, even, we talked a little bit about the Bible at the beginning, but, King David, right? When Saul was tormented, when God lifted his spirit off of Saul, he was tormented by demons. And one of the prophets told him to go find a wise man who was playing the harp, right? And David was able to play some music. I think it was on a lyre, or was it a lyre, a lyre?
Yeah, lyre, yeah.
Yeah, a lyre, and was able to soothe him, right? It soothed the demons in essence and gave him temporary peace. So, the power of music has been recorded really, I mean, it goes back thousands of years, which is pretty interesting. So, well, there's a psychologist named Annette Schreimer, and she said that rhythmic sound not only coordinates the behavior of people in a group, it also coordinates their thinking. The mental processes of individuals in the group become synchronized. So, like the rhythmic beats of a drum when, like when tribes would go to war, right? They would beat on a drum and they kind of marched to the beat of that drum. Back in the day, when we were fighting the British, they had their little rat-tat-tat-tat-tat-tat, that they would march to. And it was almost rhythmic, right? It's people almost aren't aware what they're doing. They just kind of go with the flow. And it's been really interesting. They've done all kinds of studies on the effects that music has on people. And if you think that the government, doesn't take full advantage of that with the music that we listen to today, then you're only kidding yourself, I think.
Here's a question for you. Sorry to interrupt, but
no, you're fine.
You mentioned music that we listen to today. I think you would agree with me that in general, what's considered popular music today, and older generations have probably always said this, but I think it's an empirical fact that the music that is popular today is pretty much mindless for the most part. And do you think that could be almost a dumbing down mechanism that governments or influential powers in the media use to kind of keep people pacified?
Yeah, absolutely. So, like when you break it down, I forget where I'll try and find the source and send it over to you, and maybe we can post it in the show notes. But there was a study that was done about that, right? So people that had not only just like the driving 4/4 beat, like 1, 2, 3, 4, like a simpler music that was the same like 3 chords, if you will, over and over again. They did a study of people that were listening to music like that versus music that had certain chord arrangements, but were also in different time signatures, and they would bounce back and forth. And the people, they were asked to arrange like a grocery list into certain categories. And the people that were a part of that 4/4 count, same driving beat, same driving sound, were actually more organized. They organized different things into more groups, whereas the people who listened to the different time signatures and the different arrangements and chords, they actually had a broader scope. So they included more things into a general a grouping, if you will. And so they were kind of more inclusive and broader thinkers, right? They were more big picture thinkers, or they were influenced rather by the music to be big picture thinkers and to kind of think outside of the cage, if you will, versus these other guys who were, like more, just kind of, I don't know what the word is that I'm looking for there, but they were just, they were kind of go with the flow. And not even go with the flow. They were just stuck. It almost seems like in that same 4/4 pattern, like mindlessly just listening and organizing their thoughts in that same manner. If that makes any sense. God, I talked myself in a circle.
No, that makes sense. So I'm thinking in terms of the military context, like you mentioned, the drum beat that was used going into battle against the British in the Revolutionary War, that was used War of 1812, probably right up until, the modern era in the 1900s. You'd see those drumline features within a battlefield for very good reason. Not only did it keep people in unison and in rhythm, but it also, kept the courage and the morale of the troops in line. I'm thinking now in terms of like the modern world where you see this kind of was popularized in World War II with the Germans, but like the goose step and things like that, where people marching in unison and kind of keeping a rhythmic pattern, not necessarily to music, but just a natural rhythm in the way that they would step and move. I'm wondering, is there anything that you've seen either in research or just in your own experience that would show you that I guess the natural mentality of people to want to create tribes or sort of, I guess, like herds that sort of mimic one another? Is there anything that is subconscious or linked to the human psyche that shows us that that's like a natural thing? Like, is there a reason, I guess what I'm getting at, why we all go to the same concert and 50,000 people will watch 4 or 5 people on a stage, all expecting the same experience? Like, that just seems like a weird thing. Like, if I was a creature in the animal kingdom observing humans, or an alien from outer space observing humans, and I saw all these people looking in adoration at all these other people on a stage making sounds with, pieces of wood and some strings and some brass, I would think that was a very peculiar thing. Is there something in the human psyche that causes us to, I guess, flock to that type of an experience? Are we naturally drawn to it?
See, I would think I would say that that's the way that we're created, right? I think that there is some sort of a underlying theme there, right? When I mentioned earlier that everything about us vibrates at a certain frequency, and they say that the language of the universe is in fact mathematics, right?
Yeah.
And so with vibrations of guitar strings or piano strings, or the vibrations of certain size drum mallets and drum heads that all vibrate at certain frequencies that give us certain sounds, right? And I think that, because of the way that we're wired, well, we already know, like, for instance, the frequency at which things are recorded. So back in the day, we used to record everything at 432 hertz. And a lot of people think that 432 hertz has magical properties to it, if you will, or healing properties. In fact, if you hop on YouTube and you look up you can look up all kinds of different things that have to do with 432 hertz. But there's like meditation music out there that is recorded and put out at 432 hertz. It's supposed to bring healing. It's supposed to clear your mind. People use it when they do yoga or when they're trying to meditate on something. And it's proven that if you take let's say there's a certain type of fabric, but I think it's just like a thin piece of plastic even, and you pour a bunch of sand on it and you hold it over a speaker and you emit a frequency of 432 hertz, it actually forms all kinds of different, like, beautiful shapes, which is really weird, right? So even if you decrease it, you can go to like 412, 420, 432 hertz. It creates all kinds of different beautiful shapes in the sand, similar to that of a snowflake, which in my opinion proves that the frequency at which we listen to things has a profound impact on the psyche and on the mind, right? Because what is everything but a frequency or a vibration anyway, or an electrical impulse? So, but the inverse of that is also true. So a lot of the music that we have today, when you talk about mind-numbing, just blah, blah, whatever music, is recorded at 440 hertz. In fact, they've been recording at 440 hertz since, I think, like the 70s, maybe even before that. But at 440 hertz, that sand is just a blob. There's no repeating patterns in the sand. There's nothing beautiful about it. It's almost disruptive. And, so when you talk about the impact that music can have on you, well, I mean, think about it, right? So when you think of someone who listens to metal, what do you generally think about that person?
Yeah, you get certain connotations and opinions about, their lifestyle and their demeanor, things like that.
yeah, like that they're angry, right? Or
Yeah.
they're ready to fight, they're ready to do whatever. And then there's a certain connotation around people that listen to rap music.
Sure.
There's a certain, I mean, look at the country scene, right? Everybody's running around in their boots and whatnot, and country's different now than it was back in the day.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
But even still, like, right, it was a like-mindedness that goes with this certain genre of music that appeals to you. So I definitely think that we're hardwired to be that way. In fact, there's a theory out there that Lucifer was in charge of worship, right? Back in the day, and before he was booted out of heaven, right? And he was adorned with all these stones, second in command, I guess, of heaven. And, or, he was in charge of worship. And what do we all do today that we consider worship? Well, we sing songs, right?
Sure.
And so I definitely think that there is a God-given magical property to music and what it's supposed to be utilized for.
Wasn't there a certain set of chord progressions that were like outlawed by the Catholic Church at one point? I think it's called the Devil's Tritone or something like that.
Yeah, actually, yeah. So the Devil's Tritone is so the Simpsons. The beginning of the Simpsons. Bum bum bum
Yeah.
ba-na.
That's
Yep,
it.
so
That's it.
Yep. Yeah.
Oh, wow.
That's it.
Wow.
Bum 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 ba-na is that progression is considered. It's like a diminished chord, if you will. It has almost no resolution to it versus like a C chord. When you break down the C chord, it's like a do re mi fa sol la ti da ti fa so. That whole thing, right? So there's resolution in that. There's harmony. There's peace. There's diminished chords. So the Catholic Church actually banned diminished chords, which are used more in metal music, but also in the blues. It's used heavily in the blues.
Your dog's singing the blues right now.
Yeah, my dog had a meltdown. Those diminished chords were banned because there was no resolution there. It just sounded like, and we can all think of like Stevie Ray Vaughan used it, Jimi Hendrix. So there's all types of different modes that were all identified in music theory through Pythagoras, who would actually. Pythagoras would go and he would do soul adjustments on people. I mean, you could look this stuff up. He would go out and do soul adjustments. He would go into areas where people were getting ready to fight and were angry and having a complete meltdown, and he would just stop the music that was being played, and he would play or he would have a tone played, and it would like calm people down. Like it goes back to what the Bible was saying with David, like soothing the soul, soothing those sorts of things. So, I definitely think like there's a lot to it that we,
Soul adjustment. I've never heard that term before. Sorry. Is that like, so he just like plays ambient music and tries to calm people down? That's a soul adjustment?
Yep.
Wow.
Ambient music and certain chord progressions that invoke certain feelings, right?
Huh.
Which is really interesting when you really when you break it down, when you really start considering like, we kind of mindlessly just listen to music nowadays, right? And we feed. Well, there was a lady that I knew back in the day. She told me the nature in which you feed is the nature in which you grow, and that I didn't realize.
Whoa. Say that again. Sorry, I gotta process that.
Yeah, the nature in which you feed is the nature in which you will grow.
Oh, wow, that's heavy.
Well, so think about it, man. Think about if everything's a vibration. They've done experiments, and I know that you've seen this, where people will speak nothing but loving words and kind words to a plant. And then another plant, they will berate it and bash it and tell them how much they hate it and say hateful, evil things to it. And they're both in the same control setting, and it's nothing but words. And it will profoundly impact the growth that the plant has.
Yeah, that's a big part of quantum theories, that you can alter the molecular structure of an organism by, the the type of words you speak into it. Believe it or not, it's wild. But they found some links to that seem to hold up under trials. They tested it with water, and it showed some pretty weird results.
Yeah, isn't that wild? So think about what that does for your kids, right? Think about those of you who have kids and the kind of words that you speak toward your children, or that your children hear you speaking to your spouse. Think about the kind of impact that has on their psyche, because we all know that kids are sponges. They soak up everything that we say and do. And so it really should give you pause to stop and take a step back and think about, what are you really saying? Because I'm guilty of it, right? When I'm getting around with my friends and we have a few drinks, we say a ton of stuff, right? And just don't even realize that our kids are in the room, we don't realize the impact that could potentially be having, especially on children, right? If we have that kind of an impact on plants or on water, right? The Bible even says the power of life and death is in the tongue, right? So if we have that kind of profound effect with our words, then we should really consider whatever we say, but what we listen to, what we let our kids listen to, the movies that we watch. Those sorts of things all have dramatic, huge impacts in our lives and move us in certain directions. And I think that, if we want to get conspiratorial with it, I think that the governments or the powers that be understand that. In fact, there's a lot of good evidence that suggests that the whole hippie movement back in the 60s, they kind of resurrected some of those lesser known modes from that Pythagoras came up with, and that it invoked certain feelings of dissent. And screw you, man, like Bob Dylan, like I'm in the basement talking about the government, right? Rebellion. Yeah. And right around that same time that counterculture started to move, that's when LSD and other weird drugs got kind of leaked into society. Ironically, our government had been experimenting on people with those same drugs just the decade before.
Yeah, it's one wild thing about that. Well, first of all, let me say, I think some of the best music ever came out of the 60s. So I'm a huge Dylan fan, a big fan of the Doors, the Beatles. Zeppelin, yeah. It's amazing. And you and I would agree with, a lot of, the quality of music that came out of that generation is, like, bar none, some of the best ever made. But I totally agree with you that there has to be a link between some of the experimentation that was going on with psychedelics and mind-altering drugs and the movement that came out of that. What people tend to forget, though, is that before the hippie movement of the 60s and 70s, there were the beatniks. So in the 1950s, you had the beatnik generation, which was more like jazz music and spoken word poetry and all that. Jack Kerouac, who's kind of a founding father of the beatniks, he wrote the book On the Road, one of my all-time favorites. And he actually, near the end of his life, and he did die young, he was asked what he thought about the 60s and the hippie movement that was birthed, because even then people saw it as a birthing of something that came out of the beatnik movement. And he sounded like a sad father who had like a wayward son. He said that he didn't recognize the free love hippie movement of the 60s as being the continuation of the movement that he and his generation had started, the Ginsbergs and the Kerouacs. He said that he saw them, and you'll appreciate this, he said he saw it as a frenzied Dionysian worship, basically a bacchanalia, where he saw them as like crazed, pandemonium-filled individuals who were basically chasing after Dionysus. And for those who don't know, Dionysus was the Greek god of, revelry and wine and partying. And he said it basically somewhere between the late 50s and the early 60s that society had lost its way, and that this great social experiment that the beatniks were starting went off track, and that's how we got the hippie movement in the 60s. And kind of back to your point, I'm wondering if the government, with MK Ultra, Agent Orange, all that stuff going on, I'm wondering if any of that was intentional to kind of divert the counterculture.
So I think that was definitely kind of conspiratorial in a sense, like from a government standpoint. The stuff that the government's declassified, you could do a whole episode on that. You know, that our own government poisoned a water supply with LSD in some French city and blamed it on moldy bread in a bakery. Right?
Sounds like something we would do.
Dude, totally. Like, what are you doing? Like, we're just gonna poison a city of people and blame it on a bakery. No big deal.
Yeah, why? Because America. That's why.
Because America, right? Let's I don't know. Let's see what happens. I don't know. But pretty, man. I see. So I think, and to me, a lot of music, especially from that 60s and 70s, they started getting weird, right? The Doors, Jim Morrison was all philosophical and whatnot. And he read a lot of books of different philosophers. And one massive influence that has impacted not only today's society, but especially music has been Aleister Crowley. I don't think you've done an episode on him yet. You might consider, So that guy has had a profound impact. Let's just talk, since we're on the topic, musical industry, right? That guy was into all kinds of weird stuff. Ozzy, did a song about him called Mr. Crowley.
The Beatles put him on the cover of Sgt. Pepper's. He's on the cover of the album.
He's on the cover. And ironically, John Lennon said that they take their doctrine, what they believe, they dip it in honey, they put it to a sweet tune, and they provide it to the masses. So,
do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law. I believe that was the famous saying, right?
So yeah, dude. So that came from Aleister Crowley, and that has permeated everything. Peanut from 311, to bring it back around to them, he's got that tattooed on his leg. Jimmy Page from Led Zeppelin, actually, they recorded an album or two inside Aleister Crowley's old house. Jimmy Page was fascinated with him. His little, like how Robert Plant had the feather and Jimmy Page had Zoso.
Yeah.
Zoso was like short for Zoroastrian. Am I saying that right?
Yeah, Zoroastrianism, the old Persian religion.
Yeah, Persian religion, which has its roots in Jewish Kabbalism and mysticism, and this guy Aleister Crowley was just a spoiled brat that had a ton of money. He came from money, so he literally ran around the world and studied all types of different occults and religions and Egyptian stuff and all those hidden knowledge, if you will. And he practiced sex magic, black magic. He spent years of his life trying to make himself disappear in the mirror.
Yeah.
And so bands like the Red Hot Chili Peppers, they recorded in Aleister Crowley's house. In fact, their first album, Blood Sugar Sex Magic.
Yeah.
I mean, come on.
Oh, yeah. He spelled magic with a K, too, on that album, right?
Yep. And K is a special letter to those types of people that follow numerology and magic that's spelled with a K. The number 11, right? K is the 11th letter of the alphabet. There's all kinds of, you could do a whole study on numerology and all the weird stuff that's behind that. I mean, you talked about what was the secret, the Harry Manback? What's the guy? What's that guy's name?
Harry
Not
Manback.
the Tool song.
Oh, I thought that's what you were talking about. What are you talking about?
Manly P. Hall. There we go.
That's a long way from Harry Manback.
Harry is both in there.
Okay, yeah, Manly P. Hall. Yeah, the number 11. I've had some weird, strange encounters with that number myself over the years. But I didn't realize that many artists had a link to Crowley and the occult. But that's wild. If I'm not mistaken, Jimmy Page bought that house on Loch Ness, right?
That is correct. Yep.
Wow.
He bought and owned that house, and I forget who it was. I think it was a record producer or something like that. He went out there. Actually, Robert Plant thinks that Zeppelin was cursed because of him. Robert Plant blamed Jimmy Page for the death of his son, Carrick.
Oh, wow.
Because of his dabbling in black magic. And he and whoever, Jimmy Page and this record producer had a massive falling out. And that record producer basically put a curse on him, and it didn't affect Jimmy Page, but it was one bad thing after another. His kid got sick, and almost died. He went back home. They had to cancel the tour. Oh, Robert Plant got sick. Then when Robert Plant was working on his car, one of the jacks came loose and crushed his ribs. and then his son ultimately died, and then they called it. And then John Bonham died, and Robert Plant blamed him for all of his dabbling around in that black magic. And that's just for starters. I mean, you already mentioned the Beatles putting him on his cover, right? Yeah. Or Tool, who's, you and I both love.
Love Tool.
Yeah, one of my favorite bands of all time, even A Perfect Circle, but they're into all kinds of occult stuff, and it's just crazy. In fact, a lot of what's even crazier, we can even tie it into science. Today's science is actually they're understanding that a lot of these occults back in the day and these different like alchemy books and the Jewish Kabbalah thing and the Tree of Life and oh god, I don't know why it's slipping my mind, but a lot of these theories that we have that are proven today all have their roots in these like secret societies and hidden knowledge things that were out thousands of years ago, and we're coming to the same conclusion now because it's all based off of this, I guess Book of Enoch premise that we were given this secret knowledge from these fallen angels. I mean, if you really want to bring it back to that and get weird with it, but it's like just the music alone, man, everything has been infiltrated.
Yeah, let's get weird with it. No, I was going to say that you make a good point that this isn't some like weird coincidence that these musicians are just stumbling upon or trying to be edgy with, some of these ties to occultists. They aren't just stumbling upon these things. Like these parallels are intentional. I think it's the song Lateralis, right, where Maynard actually, and the band Tool again, that they actually composed that whole song to the Fibonacci sequence. So Fibonacci sequence of numbers, like that whole song follows a Fibonacci sequence, which is almost impossible to do, right? And it's definitely not something you can do by accident. So there's some intentionality behind that goes beyond, just making quality music. There's some sort of like breaking through to the other side going on there. Like there's some esotericism.
Solid Doors reference there.
Yeah, well, it's weird though. I mean, there's something going on there. Like they're trying to achieve something metaphysical, I believe, at least in that song. I wish I could play it, man. Due to copyright rules, I can't play the song in the podcast. But if you guys haven't heard Lateralis, check it out. That whole song's composed to a Fibonacci sequence, and Maynard, who's brilliant, like he's done some interviews where they talk about that, and I think it took them like months and months just to compose that one song because of how complicated it was. I mean, you don't do something like that unless you're trying to accomplish something supernatural. I mean, truly, I think supernatural.
So Danny Carey, actually the drummer of that band, his dad was heavy into the occult and occult practices. And if you go and check out any of his interviews where he's completely open with it, he talks about trapping a demon in a lodge, which apparently is some sort of weird like circle thing that you can do to like trap a spirit in, if you will, and using that as inspiration for their albums and his drum playing. In fact, his whole drum kit, I believe, is set up in the circles and squares of Jerusalem, and I don't even know what that means.
Huh.
So there's a lot to it, man. But it's not just like the metal bands, right? Of course, like you think Led Zeppelin, they were dark. I mean, Zeppelin had that whole backmasking thing. I don't know if you ever remember that with Stairway to Heaven. Did you ever hear about that?
No, I'm not sure. What is that?
So yeah, you and your listeners can go check this out. You can do a little research, but in Stairway to Heaven, on the record, people at that time were burning their record because they believed that if you played it backwards, they would say like "Glory to my King Satan" and "Worship to my King Satan." That was a whole thing.
I love the devil. Like it's all in the like it's weird, record voice when you play it backwards.
Yeah.
Is that true though? Because I've heard like a lot of people make fun of that, saying like you could do that with pretty much any record. Like supposedly the White Album, the Beatles, when you play it backwards, it says Paul is dead. Like I don't know how much of that is authentic.
I don't know. Missy Elliott did that one song, "Flum Flum Circumfligums in Yet."
There you go.
But do you know what's crazy about that? If you play that part backwards, she's actually saying the phrase prior to that line backwards. That's the prior phrase backward.
What was it?
If you will wait a second, I will look it up.
Didn't she perform that at the Super Bowl a couple of years ago with Katy Perry?
I guess so. I know that there's some like redneck white chick that did a like karaoke thing at some campground that Ellen had on the show. That was hilarious. If you haven't seen that, you should probably check that out.
Yeah, I haven't. I'll have to check it out.
I'll look that up later. But yeah, I'm pretty sure that's like I'm pretty accurate with that. Oh yeah, the work it verse explained. Here we go. I pulled it right up. So what is she really saying? People are freaking out after figuring out what Missy Elliott was actually saying. So this is according to BuzzFeed, and here's the proof. Now, a careful reading may reveal that the number of people freaking out over this particular revelation is not counting replies. Blah blah blah. Finally figuring out. So, which is the line after "put my thing down, flip it, and reverse it" is just the same line run backwards. Okay. So yeah, put my thing down,
it makes
flip
sense.
it, and reverse it is like from Lum Flecken Zegen Yet, whatever that is.
Yeah.
Whatever that whole. I can't do it. I know the song, but yeah. So I mean, I don't know. I mean, there might be some kind of a truth to that. I mean, considering like the influence that this one person has had, not only on that, but like on society as a whole, and like the secret societies in general and the weird stuff that they perform. You know, I'm sure a lot of your listeners are probably familiar with Bohemian Grove, right?
Oh yeah.
You know, the giant owl Molech that they there's some video that circulated.
Yeah, I believe Alex Jones was the one who infiltrated it back in the early 2000s, and I think he had a foot camera on his shoe or something, and he saw the cremation of care ceremony where they do a mock cremation of a human child in the arms of the great owl Molech, who was worshipped in some of the Levant and Middle Eastern tribes, even in like Carthage, I think they worshipped Moloch for a while, but they were still doing this apparently in these mock ceremonies. And this is like rich Republicans and Democrat, leaders in the government who were doing this, and also like influential powers in Hollywood and Northern California as recently as hell, they still do it, but they just don't let anybody in anymore. For those of you who haven't heard of it.
Yeah, I mean, think about that though, right? A lot of those weird things that they're doing to this day. I mean, you might not believe it's true, but these people that are running our country do.
Yeah, that's true.
You know, the musicians and all the records that you listen to, they all believed it was true.
Yeah.
You know, so much so that they would write songs about it. In fact, I believe there's a quote out there somewhere about Elton John talking about even poetry and I don't know what it is. It's like in the form and the way in which they write their songs is in like a witch type of language. I don't know what the particular name for it is. I don't know if you do, Josh. Do you?
I don't think so.
Yeah. So there's a quote out there where Elton John said that he's never written a song that wasn't in this particular type of witch type of language, where it's like repeating consonants and sounds and rhythmic patterns that are all written throughout the lyrics, which really, you know, I mean, let's be honest, it makes for good art, you know.
Yeah.
But you know, there's a certain power to that, right? And an ability to influence, an ability to make it easier to remember things, right? Like, did you ever learn the Capitals, like the United States Capitals song?
Yeah. We learned it to music. Yeah, there's a rhythm.
There's a rhythm to it. There's a natural rhythm to everything. There's a natural rhythm to the way that the human body works, the way that nature works. So I think, you know.
Well, good point you bring up about that is like the Old Testament. You know, Jewish scholars and rabbis would memorize the entire Old Testament, and people would say, "Well, how could they do that? There's no way you could do that." It was to music. Like they all memorized it to music. The same with like Enuma Elish and the Epic of Gilgamesh. You know, they would all memorize these ancient texts to music. It wasn't just reciting them like we would do now when we try to memorize things. You could literally memorize an entire book if you do it to music. If you don't believe me, think of all the useless song lyrics you have in your head from when you were like 10 or 12 years old. Like, I could probably recite every lyric to an album that I listened to on repeat when I was 12 or 13, but yet I can't remember one paragraph in a good book or a required reading assignment. And that's because of the musical component. People would do that with the Bible and with all sorts of other texts in the old world. And great memorization practitioners today will still do it. They'll memorize things to music, and it's amazing what you can retain when music's involved.
Yeah, I mean, so that's a very valid point, you know? I mean, I can sit there and quote all kinds of lyrics, but I can't remember the conversation that I had with my wife yesterday,
Yeah.
you know? And it's just wild, man. When you really just sit down and consider like the influence that music has over you, the way that the lyrics are written, even talking about Tool's Lateralus, and that's all based off of a Fibonacci sequence. That's like at the very end of that song, he's like, spiral out, keep going. Well, the Fibonacci sequence is the golden, what is it? The golden triangle. It's the repeating square. It's the same thing in Da Vinci, the drawing of Da Vinci, where the man has his legs spread and his hands reached out, and he draws that spiral of that form in nature. It's a thing that's repeated in nature all over the place. It's similar to pi, right? Did you ever actually, speaking of pi, did you ever see that movie Pi?
No, I have not seen the movie.
Dude, that's something that you and your listeners should go check out. That was like it's a black and white film, but it's like this guy who's a mathematician. And he's trying to figure out like the secrets of pi and like what God's name is. God's like energy and never ending and eternal, just like, the number pi and how it's perfect and its symmetry and all kinds of it's really good. Yeah. You should definitely go check that out. But okay. It's just man, there's just so much to it that I think it's really tough to it's a mosaic, right? So it all kind of seems jumbled up, but when you step back and you take a look at the mosaic, when you're able to see the whole picture, you can see how everything kind of ties together,
Yeah. So there was a question I wanted to ask you about something you said earlier about the hertz being upped in modern music, and I was wondering, is that universal across genre, or is that just popular music? Like, is that something that's been modified across genres, or are there still certain genres of music that follow the older practice of, the different rhythmic pattern?
Yeah, I think I think like in classical music and perhaps some of the like more classical type of songs. So like, guitar classics where it's just like guitars playing and whatnot. I think that that's maybe recorded at it's maybe recorded at a different hertz. Well, here's one for you. 432 hertz, which is like considered, or it was considered, the perfect like harmonizing hertz at which you could vibrate things. Mm-hmm. If you square 432 hertz, you actually get the speed of light.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. So it's pretty interesting. So like there was an article. I think it was a blog that I read on like projectyourself.com. Hang on, I think I have it pulled up here. Yeah, so 432 hertz, which is known as Verity's A, is actually an alternative tuning which is mathematically consistent with the universe. The music, which is actually based on 432 hertz, transmits some beneficial healing energy as it is a pure tone of math fundamental to nature.
Wow, it goes back to what you said about the universe being ordered according to mathematics. I've long believed, and I think with evidence like this and what we're talking about now, it just only lends further credence to the case that God must be a mathematician. Like whoever was the prime mover of the cosmos has to have a mathematical mind, because just the order of creation and just the way things work. Like I've talked about this in the podcast before, but last year, I saw the solar eclipse that swept across the U.S. and just seeing how perfect that it, like, dude, like I was almost in tears trying to talk about it, and just thinking about it now is overwhelming, because there is nothing to compare it to. Like just 1 minute, you're going about your normal life, and the next minute your entire reality is literally blacked out. And the perfection of it, like down to the most minute fraction, the sun is blotted out by the moon, even though they're separated by billions of miles and totally different in size. The odds of that just happening by accident are insane, and the mathematics behind that are like 1 in 10 trillion. So it's beyond logic to think that it just happened by chance. And ever since I saw that, I've been thinking in terms of mathematics and order of creation, and you just see how everything fits together perfectly with such intentionality. And it's like the one thing that I always keep coming back to is that there's so much intentionality, despite how much random chaos we think happens around us. There is certainly an intentionality, at least in the rules of nature, the way that physics, operate in the cosmos. And, that translates into music too. And I think music has the divine signature in it, like you were talking about. So it only makes sense to think that there are healing properties and maybe even destructive properties that can be garnered from it, because it's something that's divinely created. It's an artistic expression of the created world.
Couldn't have said it better myself, man. So that same article, here's what they have to say about the 440 hertz, which is what probably 99% of our music is recorded at today, right? So 440 hertz is, in fact, the unnatural standard tuning frequency, which is removed from the symmetry of sacred vibrations, as well as overtones, which also has declared war on the subconscious mind of Western man. In one paper, which is entitled Musical Cult Control, irony, Dr. Leonard Horowitz wrote, the music industry features this imposing frequency, which is herding, quote unquote, populations into some greater aggression, psychosocial agitation, as well as emotional distress, predisposing people to some physical illness. Now think about what we have going on in society today. Think about the reactions. Think about social media and the impact that that's having in people's lives, and the division that is currently out there. I mean, right or left, it doesn't matter. There's so much division, especially in the States, where there's an emphasis almost on the arts. I mean, I just thought that was pretty profound. And so I'm getting to the good stuff. And so in this quote, in the article, it continues, all you need to do is go out in the street and look around you. I didn't know that was coming. What do you see? School kids, young adults going to the workplace, a woman pushing her baby in a prom, a man walking his dog, and what every one of them has in common, iPods or MP3 players, right? Ingenious. Nikola Tesla quoted, if you want to find the secrets of the universe, think in terms of energy, frequency, and vibration. So I think you've talked a little bit about Nikola Tesla on your show a little bit, right?
Yeah, Nikola Tesla had a theory of, electricity that could have completely transformed the world. His distribution method was completely opposite of what Edison had in mind. And if Nikola Tesla had his way, we would all be able to, stick a rod in the ground and draw energy from it, and we wouldn't have to pay for electricity. He was way ahead of his time. Like his vision of the world, if you ever get a chance to look into it, was brilliant. But he ended up dying, penniless and, just really, down on his luck, because, the world couldn't find a way to make a profit off of his ideas. So they basically forced him out. But he was a brilliant thinker.
Oh, yeah. I mean, he came up with wireless technology, hundreds of years ago, and what did they do? Like they got it, and he believed in mathematics, right? The number, I think 9 was his like obsession. And what happened, right? They burned all of his stuff, and supposedly everything was lost. So it's just, man, there's just so much that I think goes on behind the scenes of powers that be, like principalities of darkness, if you will. Confucius was quoted saying, if one should desire to know whether a kingdom is well governed, if its morals are good or bad, the quality of its music is going to furnish the answer.
Oh, interesting. The quality of its music will furnish the answer. Well, I think we have our answer, right?
I mean, right? I mean,
Wow.
think about it. Look at today's society and just what a freaking train wreck, really, society is as a whole.
Let
We argue about the sexual nature of puppets.
Yeah, I saw that meme that you posted on Facebook a few days ago. It's a good point. I mean, we're talking about the Bert and Ernie Sesame Street thing that's been on the news the last few days. It's ridiculous that our society's got to that point, but the pendulum seems to swing every few years, right? Like the country will go extreme right and then it'll go extreme left, and then we never seem to find that balance. So we're always arguing over stupid things, but it seems like it's getting worse and worse, and that each time the pendulum swings, it swings farther. Although I think it's ultimately going to end up swinging way too far to the left, in my opinion, because seems to be the direction that the powers that be want it to go. But yeah.
Sort of globalist outcome.
Yeah, I think so. Like eliminating any sort of distinctive markers, right? Gender barriers, racial barriers, national boundaries and barriers, like anything that can be considered a dividing line is, there's a push to erase it to the point where it's just a complete egalitarian society, which I think is a bad thing for reasons we've talked about on the show before. Not that I have, anything against other races or women or people of other sexes or sexual preferences. Not at all. On the contrary, I just think that to treat everything the same is to treat everything as worthless, really. Like the thing that makes us valuable and unique is our individuality, the separation and the distinctions between us. But society seems to be going a different direction with that, but I don't want to get on my soapbox.
Well, I mean, it almost seems to me like with naturalism, I think we've seen almost a void of spirituality, right? Naturalism and, the materialistic world that we live in, and it's created a spiritual void, right? And so I think that we're starting to get glimpses, right? People are starting to wake up, and they're starting to almost wake up from their slumber and realizing that something isn't right. I mean, this is your show, right, is what brought you and I together, because I think we both recognize, like, we're in some kind of a weird juxtaposition of the way that things should be and the way that things are and what we wish, things could be. And I think that there's slowly but surely more and more kind of people waking up to that. But I think people, that the naturalism and materialistic world has kind of created this void, and people are starting to become more spiritual, but it's in a sense, if you will, like they're striving for apotheosis, but they're turning toward, instead of turning toward God, they're turning toward technology, and that technology is going to be our liberators. That's what's going to allow us to transcend our current messed up state, right? And maybe achieve some sort of type of godhood, if you will, right? Like, if you look at science and where science is today, I mean, they're already figuring out back in 2014 that they're pretty sure that they can teach people how to download things like they did in the Matrix. You'll be able to download information. So they already have done this experiment in rats. They were able to plug into its medulla oblongata, which is one of the best body parts ever named ever.
The water boy.
Yeah. Yes.
You remember that scene, right? Yeah, the professor.
Medulla oblongata.
Something's wrong with his medulla oblongata.
So good. God, back when Adam Sandler was not doing just Netflix specials. But they were actually able, so they used a rat that had learned its way through the maze, and they used a rat, the same rat, used the rat and basically programmed it from what the knowledge of what the other rat knew, and it was able to make its way through the maze on the first try. And they repeated it over and over again with the same results with different rats. So the biggest thing that we're trying to do. I mean, Google has a patent on trying to figure out a cure for death, right?
Yeah.
And you and I talked a little bit about Elon Musk when I got to see you, and he's petrified of artificial intelligence, and he actually said within the next year or two, I believe, on that podcast, that he would be coming out with just that, like a chip or some kind of an add-on to the human being that would allow us to basically become our cell phones, right? And he made the argument that we already are a type of cyborg, right? That our cell phones are a part of us. I mean, we always have them on us. We're always looking up information on it. And, because of his fear of artificial intelligence taking over the world, like Terminator and the Matrix, he, is working on developing merging man and machine. And it's very interesting.
Yeah, Ray Kurzweil says that we're like 10 to 15 years away from the singularity where, the symbiosis happens where man merges with machine. But Elon Musk, has been raising a lot of concerning alarms here, saying that, we should be on the alert for AI. But it is true, and he's right, others have said it as well, that we already are on the road to becoming cyborgs. You're just being slowly conditioned to it. But the cell phone has already become an appendage, basically. It's an extension of our arm and our mind. It's only a small step from here to integrating that technology, with the human body. And I think that we're well on our way to doing that. Just like the smartphone revolution took the world by storm in 2007, 2008, 2009. I think that biotech will do the same thing relatively soon here.
Oh, and I think it's going to be available to the entire world too. I mean, Mark Zuckerberg, he has a fascination with trying to, I guess, the latest I heard was he was trying to put drones all over the world in order to allow free access to the internet to the other, it's like 3 or 4 billion people that don't have internet access. Mm-hmm. So they're trying, and him and Bill Gates are trying to basically monitor, the whole world, to kind of rip off of another podcast I listened to, Canary Cry Radio, shameless plug. They have like the 4 horsemen of the technocratic apocalypse, right? So Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk, Bill Gates, and Mark Zuckerberg.
Wow. And you make a good point. Whether people are interested in these things or not, it's irrelevant, because the fact of the matter is that the powers that be, the people who you pay your taxes to, they are interested, regardless of whether or not you are. And to be honest, that's a large part of the reason why I started this podcast. Not that my tiny little podcast is important in the grand scheme of things, but it was my motivation because, I know that people are looking for answers. As much as the world tries to sell us on this narrative of apathy where people just don't care and all they care about is the latest pop single and, scrolling through social media on their phone. Yeah, at face value, that's true. But internally, people are seeking, and there's still a subset of people who are certainly looking for truth and looking for, deeper meaning behind, the facade. And I created this podcast to try to reach those people, not because I have the answers, because I certainly don't, but to at least ask better questions and send people in the right direction, and see how deep the rabbit hole goes. And then you can kind of start to draw conclusions for yourself. But there just seems to be a void of clarity in terms of, asking the right questions or even understanding the right questions to ask. And the world is moving ahead so rapidly that, you can't keep up. You'll fall behind so quickly, and it's a whirlwind. Like, it seemed like yesterday we had dial-up internet and the world was a simple place. And, if you wanted to watch porn, you had to print out a screenshot. And now,
yeah.
Now everything's at your fingertips, like every vice, every addiction. And I say it tongue in cheek, but it's true.
Well, it's the modern day knowledge of it's the tree of good and knowledge of good and evil, man. I mean, You can find anything good on it. You can find anything evil on it. Back in the day, you'd have to to use your porn reference. You'd have to seek out porn, right?
And it was an exercise. Like, you had to really, really want it to find it. Trust me, I remember. I was 13 when we had dial-up internet. So
yeah, and nowadays, like, you're putting blockers on your kid's phone so that it doesn't seek them out.
Yeah, your 8 and 9-year-olds, not even phones, like tablets, like anything that can
Yeah.
access the internet. It's crazy, man. Like the world is changing, and not just parents, but like just conscious people who are concerned about the future of our race and our species. Like you need to constantly be monitoring what's going on in the world, and not just technology, but just thought systems and processes. Like you talked about the musical industry, and how the occult ideas going all the way back to Crowley have infiltrated it. And people talk about Illuminati and mainstream media music parallels, and I think there is some truth to that. But in any case, whether you believe it or not, like you have to realize that the the benchmark has changed. Like we're not the same people with the same ideas and the same moral compass that we had, even a generation ago. And sure, you can blame it on our parents' generation and the free love generation, our grandparents' generation, whatever. But at some point, we got off the track we were on, and it's leading us to wherever the hell we're going. And I'm not saying the track we were on was a perfect one, because it certainly wasn't. In fact, it may have been just as wrong for different reasons, but we need to find some sort of a compass to guide us, because the chaos that we're in, man, it's just, it's like nihilism. Like nothing has meaning anymore. Nothing has value anymore. Nothing has individuality or substance anymore. Everything is just so subjective and worthless, and just, it can just be pissed away because nothing matters. And like you see the outward expression of that in music, in film. You see it in all sorts of artistic outputs now.
Yeah, man, I could not have said that better myself. That I think that's kind of the approach. So you mentioned, at the beginning that I've got a podcast, right? And we're actually called the Average Guys Talk. And we kind of talk about all kinds of different things. I mean, we talk about Marvel. We talk about all these different topics. We talk, just random dumb stuff, right? We'll play dumb trivia games, et cetera, et cetera. But I think, a part of Noah and I, and the approach that we wanted to take when we originally started it, and this is kind of the direction that we're going to kind of go in now. We've already talked a little bit with some of the Flat Earth folks and had them on our podcast. Not that we necessarily believe in flat Earth, but we're able to kind of get a different type of message out to a different audience, right? So, and I think that's a little bit of our approach, is we want to be able to sprinkle in some of these off the wall topics that people might not necessarily be thinking about or considering, but they'll sit and listen in to a podcast of a couple of guys just being dumb, which I'm an expert at. They'll sit around, they'll listen to, some guys chatting it up with some folks and kind of be able to draw their own conclusions. And what's ironic about all of that is, neither Noah or myself neither one of us would consider ourselves to be flat earthers. But what we have discovered is that some of the responses that we got were all from people that had listened to our show that actually investigated it more, right? They went out, they looked into it for themselves, and some of those people that gave us feedback actually became flat earthers themselves.
Oh, wow.
And so I know, I mean, they make some really good points, and I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole with you today.
They need a separate show for that.
Yeah, completely separate show. But there's some really good points that are made in those things. And I think our whole intention, though, right, is just to question the reality that you've been fed, right? Mm-hmm. Question what you've been fed. Look at the people that are controlling society. And I mean all the way back. Go look at, you did a podcast on Sir Isaac Newton. That's one of my favorite ones. But look at what they were into. Look at the alchemy. Look at these different things that they believed in, and consider the source. And just think about, like, our entire society is built on these things, like Darwinism, right? I mean, back when I was in school, they taught evolution as a theory, and they just removed the word theory, and now it's just evolution, and everyone is being taught that evolution is fact, right? Mm-hmm. And so, God, dude, it's just changed so much. So we're trying to just kind of get some folks to wake up a little bit and consider something else. don't necessarily just agree with what you've been fed. Look into it for yourself. Don't just take, everything at face value. At least do your own research and try and figure this stuff out.
Yeah, and as a listener to the Average Guys podcast, I can give you a plug here and say that it's really good. And if you guys aren't subscribed to it yet, you really should, because it's not all quote unquote average guys talk. Like Dan and his co-host Noah talk about some really deep stuff sometimes. In your last episode, I know you're on a bit of a hiatus right now, but you guys were talking about the moon landing and some conspiracy theories around that, which I thought was a really interesting conversation. So you definitely do, prod your listeners along and try to get them to dive deeper and think about big abstract ideas. And at the end of the day, as a podcaster, the best thing you could hope for is that your audience goes and runs with the seed that you've dropped and planted for them, and that they cultivate it and, try to gain more understanding for themselves. So I think you're definitely doing that. And if you guys haven't listened to the show or heard of it, by all means, check it out, because it's really good and it's a lot of fun. They're really good, just making anything
just goofy.
interesting.
Just a couple of goofy dudes
guys are awesome.
Making dick jokes.
I love it. So hopefully others will too.
Yeah, man. Well, I appreciate the plug, but man, we could sit and chat about this topic for hours. So you and I met. So I for your listeners, I think I reached out to you, via, I don't know if it was Facebook or maybe I emailed you.
I think it was through the Eschaton Facebook. Yeah, I think it was.
Yeah, through the Eschaton Facebook, and you replied, and I was like, "Hey, man, like, can I give you a shout?" and we sat and had like a 2-hour long conversation, just about all kinds of random things. And I'm a firm believer that I don't believe in chaos. I don't believe that things happen for no reason. I think that there's always a reason for something happening, that there's an order to things. And I think that, you and I were definitely supposed to meet. So we were fortunate enough to catch you guys when you and your awesome family came down to visit, I believe, like your wife's grandparents, right?
Yeah, we were visiting a grandmother in Florida.
Yeah. And what was meant to be just like a couple hours turned into 4, and that's pretty much like that was all she wrote. And we were able to form a really good bond there. It's just I'm super grateful that I've been able to meet you and your family, and just like some cool connections that have been made via the podcast. And you can totally cut this part out if you don't want a million people reaching out to you.
No, trust me, that won't happen. But I second that, man. It's one of those things, like, this is not an everyday occurrence in my life. Like, I don't just go out to strangers' houses and hang out with them. I mean, I would. I definitely don't mind that experience, but it just, like, the opportunity doesn't often present itself. And when it does, it's usually somebody that you're a little skeptical about. Like, from the time you and I talked on the phone after you reached out for the first time when you listened to the podcast, I was like, oh, this guy's really cool and intelligent. It'd be cool if we ever got to meet. And then just by happenstance, I was driving through your state and through your area just last month, and I just showed up at your doorstep, and our families met and we hit it off, and it was cool. I think it was definitely like one of those divine appointments. Like this, I'm glad this happened, and it, like, for me anyway, I felt like it happened at the right time. But we talked, and this is gonna start sounding a little homosexual, but no, I'm glad we talked, because we got into a lot of this stuff. Like, we talked about some of the crazy abstract ideas that we research, you and I individually, and then on this podcast, a little bit on your podcast, and then just in our personal lives. And it made me realize that it's not just guys talking into a microphone. We have these little audiences, these little communities that we start for podcasting. But I mean, it's like you plant a seed, man, and then you have no idea where that seed's going to go. Like, the next person could be way more intelligent, way more ambitious, or just in a better social network than you, and they can share that idea and build on it and share it with a billion more people. And like, that's how it starts. And like, people just start asking better questions because that seed is planted for them, and then they take the onus up on themselves to plant it somewhere else. And when you and I met, it really, it reaffirmed for me, like, oh yeah, there's other people out there that think like this. There's other people out there that are genuinely interested. And I think, it was the beginning of, for me, I feel like it's going to be a friendship for life, because, you find that, there are people of that same ilk, I guess, that same tribe as you. You just have to be willing to put yourself out there and share your thoughts, and either they'll find you or you'll find them.
Carefully.
Yeah, carefully.
Because what if I was a weird serial killer and I just murdered you and your entire family and no one would have known about it?
I'm always packing, man. I would have put up a fight.
I believe that. That's another reason that I like you.
Well, I wanted to jump into like 3 or 4 other topics, but we're over an hour and 15 minutes in here, and I don't want to monopolize too much time.
I totally forgot about like the giant trees topics and stuff.
No, it's a good teaser. We'll do another episode sometime if you're up for it.
Yeah, well, we'll let your listeners give you some feedback. I mean, if they like it, then we'll give them more. If they don't, then I'll go kick rocks and cry myself to sleep. It's no big deal.
I have no doubts that they'll like this episode. Your knowledge around music and just like the subversive aspects of it is pretty impressive. So I know it was an education for me, and I'm pretty sure the feedback from the listeners will be the same. But I will plan on us doing a round 2 and then see where it goes from there, and then encourage again everyone to go check out your podcast. It is on a bit of a hiatus right now, but do you guys have a plan for coming back on air? Do you know when you're going to kick off again?
Yeah, actually, I just dropped like $100 on a bunch of equipment from Amazon. We just got it all in. There's still a few miscellaneous things that we've got to pick up, but Noah got his Mac fixed. We're going to be able to start recording through GarageBand or Skype or whatever, and kind of get back on track. We used to have another host. His name was Howard. He decided he wanted to go in a little bit of a different direction. He's got the Ace Report, which is a podcast telling stories of military guys. So he kind of decided to take it in a different direction. And veterans, to talk about veterans, help them get their story out there. He's also actually doing a church plant, and is taken up between those two things, and just having a family. It was too much for all of us to be able to gather up. So we just decided to kind of part ways. Noah and myself, we live really close to each other, and our families are pretty blended, if you will. Like we're, all of our kids are friends, so it's just a little bit easier. And my wife will actually be filling his spot to kind of give a skeptic's perspective, but also a female perspective as well. So it's not just a couple of biased dudes who line up similarly. One of the cool things about my wife is that she always has an astute ability to be able to keep me in check without getting too outlandish. She'd be like, "Now, Daniel, come on. Like, you're going to need to explain this to me." And so, it's good. It's like apologetics, right? For your faith and the things that you're questioning and that you're thinking about, it's good to have people challenge you. That way you can really kind of resolve what it is that you really believe, right? And make sure that you don't get too caught up. Because I know that when I first started going down that conspiracy rabbit hole, I was flooding my brain with so much, and there's so much stuff out there. I think, at one point I was pretty convinced back in like 2015 or something in September that something terrible was going to happen, and I kind of got a little bit out of hand, and she was able to kind of bring me back to center. So I think that she's going to bring a really good perspective to our show and kind of keep both Noah and I in check, which I don't know. She seems to think she can do it, and so hopefully that'll be a good dynamic there.
September 2015, was that the Jonathan Cahn one, the Harbinger? Is that what that was?
Yeah, man. So it wasn't just Jonathan Cahn and the Harbinger thing with the blood moons and all that.
Yeah. John
Hagee
was talking about all that.
Yeah, there was a bunch of people out there like talking about Nibiru. Some people thought comets were gonna come and smash into the earth and create worldwide chaos and blah blah blah, or there was gonna be disclosure. Like everybody was convinced. Now that's not to say that some pretty powerful things didn't happen. Like the Pope went to the UN and made a pretty wild presentation. If your listeners want to find out about that, I'm not going to dig into that now, but they can go on YouTube and research I think it was like September 23rd, 2015, and all the weird stuff that was supposed to happen. There was quite a bit of things that happened kind of behind the curtain, which is typically how it seems to be, right? Which is why I think like all of the Pharisees and all that stuff, they missed Jesus. They all thought that it was going to be a certain way, right? They all thought that there was going to be a leader that would deliver them militarily, and that he would, even his own disciples thought that, right? Yeah. So, we missed it. They missed it because it's kind of, there's clues hidden that you can only go back and recognize with hindsight 2020 vision. So, a lot of things that will send you down the rabbit hole. So it's very important to kind of flesh things out. Don't go rushing to your loved ones and tell them that the world's going to be ending as you start your journey of waking up.
Yeah, I get some of that with this podcast. As you can imagine, when people subscribe to a podcast called Eschaton, a lot of them come in with the notion or the assumption that it's going to be a show about the end of the world. And yeah, I'm happy to dive into that anytime, and I've talked about it a little bit on the show, but this isn't, I call it doom porn, but this isn't a doom porn type podcast.
Well, I mean, that's the very intro of your show, right? We love to scare the hell out of ourselves.
Yeah, we do. That's the thing, man. It excites us. Like, we want to imagine some sort of cataclysmic event because it scares us, and humans like to be frightened a little bit, especially when we think it's some sort of, ultimate reckoning that's coming, because we feel a bit justified. And when it comes to the biblical apocalypse, Jesus himself says no man can know the day or the hour, but you can recognize the season. So I'm not saying that we should completely discredit any conversation around the end of the world, but I try not to spend much time there because I think it's kind of futile and there's bigger things to talk about. But I've had more than a few people subscribe to this podcast thinking that that's what they're getting, to be sadly disappointed when I start talking about things like, I don't know, Isaac Newton or, textual criticism.
But see, that is so good, and that ties directly in, right, to the name of the show, right? It's not just a one-sided point of view. I think you do a really good job of covering those bases. And I, for one, which, by the way, I tried to send that episode, the Manly P. Hall one, where the confirming of the biblical end of the age is actually in the occult and Leo and all that stuff. I don't want to throw too many spoilers out there, but I tried to copy it and copy the link and send it to him, and he said it wouldn't download. So is that still on your platform?
Oh, weird. Yeah, you can actually pull it off my website. Every episode's on my website. It's just my name, joshuawisely.com. And you can play it from there. It should also
I'll send him that link. Yeah, okay. That'll be good enough. But no, man, you do a great job of covering those topics and just waking me up to a completely alternative idea or way of thinking that I think definitely ties in to all of this, and I think it's great. So I love the work that you're doing, man, and I'm just super grateful that it brought us together.
Thanks, man. I feel the same way, but I'll also spare the listener from us singing each other's praises any longer. So
that's fair.
I'll continue this off air, but hey, I want to say thank you for your time, and thank you for all your valuable insight, and we'll have to do this again sometime if you're up for it.
Absolutely, man. I look forward to it. Thanks for having me on.
All right, man. See you.
Later.
And anytime you introduce fear into a logical process, whether it's linear, spherical, or otherwise, you're going to distort things.